If we focus upon the provincial as well as the local administration, we find that there were several divisions which vary in their size. For instance, in the inscriptions we find references to Vishaya, Rashtra, Nadu, and each are different in their size, in their scope, and it shows that obviously there was a hierarchy among the provincial divisions. Now, when we focus upon Vishaya, it was ruled by, it was administered by Vishayapati. In the case of Rashtra or Nadu also, there were, for instance, in the case of Nadu, it was, there are references to Nattar, who were administering this smaller administrative division. Where from this provincial division comes? Possibly when the kingdom is growing through aggrandizement, the vanquished rulers of a particular locality, they were not altogether thrown away, but they were incorporated within the expanding, aggrandizing larger political unit. In the Chalukyan inscriptions, we find references to Bana Vishaya. Now, obviously, it was the lineage domain of the Banas, who had a long history, and for a considerable period their lineage domain was annexed by the Chalukyan king. They were not altogether thrown away. The local administration remained in their hands if they paid occasional tribute as well as supplied with the required forces as and when required, as and when there was a military engagement. In the Pallava country, particularly in the northern part of the Pallava country, we find that there were different type of administrative division. There were Kottam, then there were Nadus, and finally at the lower level, at the village level, it was the Ur. Now, Kottam, it had a long history, pre-Pallavan history in south, particularly in that region around, say, the northern part of present Tamil Nadu. There the provincial administrative division was known as Kottam. Traditionally the number has been given as 24, but if we go through, if we glean informations from the inscriptions, we find the number is a bit more, around 27. Like the Pulal Kottam, Manavir Kottam, there were several Kottams in which the whole kingdom was divided. Then there were Nadus. Nadus, they are larger than, they may be a kind of conglomeration of several villages, and in a particular inscription from Nandivarman II Pallava Malla, we find that in Kasakudi plate, it is said that the order is addressed to a Nattar Kanga. After the reception of the order, actually he takes the follow up action and removes the older inhabitants, older landholders, and then clears the land and makes it ready for donation to a Brahmin Doni. So, this was the role of the Nadu and the Nattar, and at the village level we find things like Ur or Grama, which also was a distinct administrative division, and there were Ayuktas and other functionaries who were looking after the administration of the at the village level. At the village level, we find that at least in the Pallava country, we find that there are also different types of village assemblies were there. In the Brahmadeyas, the villages which has been donated to a single Brahmin or a group of Brahmins, which was known as the Brahmadeya, they were ruled by, they were administered by an assembly which was known as Sabha, and there were several inscriptions. For instance, the famous Uttaramerur inscription, then Ukkal inscription. It shows that from the 8th century onwards, the Sabhas had a very well organized administrative setup with different committees which were known as the Varyam, and these Varyams, these committees, looked after different activities of the village assembly. For instance, from the inscription dated on the 9th regnal year of Dantivarman. Dantivarman rules from 796 onwards, so it comes to around 803-4. This Dantivarman's inscription shows that there was a committee known as the Samvatsara Varyam, the committee which will look after the activities for the whole year. And likewise, there were several other Varyams and Ganas who were looking after, and they becomes very active from the days of Nandivarman II Pallava Malla. At least inscriptionally, we can say they became very active from Nandivarman's time, Nandivarman II's time, and these Varyams, they were looking after different activities. Those villages which has not been granted to a Brahmin or Brahmin Donis, they were, the assembly was known as Ur, and though it is not very explicitly stated, it seems that these Ur or assembly Ur was, the participation was from the whole of the village population, at least who has reached a considerable age. And then we have Nagaram. Nagaram means a kind of mercantile establishment, and with these three, the Pallava village administration was at least substantially well administered. In the case of the Chalukyan kingdom, we find references to Gavundas. Gavundas were possibly the village headmen who were the go-between the central administration and the local administration. From Chalukyan inscription, we find references to several Gavundas, particularly one Jayasena, who donates for building of a Jain establishment, Jain religious establishment. And there were other functionaries also working at the village level. If we then shift to the army establishment, because already at the very beginning we have seen that the period that we are discussing was full of incessant struggle between the warring families, warring dynasties, Chalukyans, Pallavas and the Pandyans, we find references to the army organization as well. According to the tradition, the Indian army was divided into 4 corps, the Chaturanga Valam, but the chariot fell into disuse during the period that we are discussing. Chariot was no more functionally very important other than the ceremonial purpose, at least in the warfare, in the battlefield it was no more so very important as a fighting arm. But the elephants played a very significant role in the warfare, as demonstrated by the inscriptions as well as substantiated from the pictorial depictions which we find in the temple friezes. For instance, in Vaikuntha Perumal temple, we find innumerable pictorial representation of the elephant being used in warfare. And Gaja Shastra, that is the science of the elephants, becomes very important, and some of the Pallava kings are stated to be proficient in the science of elephants, understanding their mood and looking after their well-being. Some of the Pallava kings were very proficient in that. Apart from the elephant corps, then there were the cavalry as well as the infantry, which also played a very significant role. And other than the inscriptional references, for instance, in Kurram plates, Kurram plate is very important, very significant, because it gives a very picturesque description of a battlefield of Parameshwara Varman II, and then we find references to the army organization, who fought and with what kind of implements they were fighting. So, inscriptions also give us a very important idea about what was going on. there was another arm, the navy, though not very clear from the inscriptional as well as the literary evidences, but it is stated that some of the Pallava kings, they made successful invasion, they led successful invasion to Sri Lanka, which could not have been possible other than having a strong navy. Though the picture is not very clear, but it seems that navy also comprised a very significant part of the army establishment, because in the Chinese sources there are references to one Pallava king having a kind of deputation that he will be sending a navy which will help, which will try to defeat the people on the Western Asia, a very ambitious kind of a boastful thing, but at least it is stated from the Chinese informations. And there are some instances when it seems that there was a very lively connection with the Southeast Asian countries, between Pallavas and the Southeast Asian countries. And if the Chalukyans had successfully captured Revati Dweep, that is the present Goa, it could not have been possible without having a naval arm. Very few direct reference of these taxes can be found from the inscriptions, but there are ample evidences through oblique references. How is it? Most of the inscriptions in its nature, in their nature, they are donative inscriptions. The state or some locality notable, they are donating, they are granting lands or any other types of gifts to a religious functionary. It may be to the Brahmins, the Brahmadeya, or it may be to a particular temple which is known as Devadanam or Devabhogam, or it is directed to the Buddhist as well as Jain monastic orders, which is generally noted by the Tamil term Pallichandam. Now, all these things, when they are being granted, they have a portion which states the kind of taxes they are exempted from, which is known as the parihara. So, from the list of the parihara, we can have an idea what kind of taxes the king, the state was generally accustomed to of taking from the locality. For instance, though the incidence, though the actual quantum, the actual proportion of the land tax is not given, but we find the reference of Irai. Irai means land tax. It is generally stated Iraili, which means exempted from paying land tax. Actually, it was not exemption. Generally, it was that earlier what the people had to pay to the state exchequer, they are now being directed to, they are now to be paid to the new donee. It may be the Brahmin establishment, Brahmadeya, or it may be directed to the temple or the religious institution for which the grant has been done. From there we can gather names of several types of taxes. For instance, there is a particular name Alona Gula Chobham, that means which is free from the disturbances of salt, a curious name, but it has a kind of particular reference because earlier making of salt was a kind of royal monopoly, and the king or the state used to give this right of manufacturing salt to individuals for payment of a kind of royalty. It is stated as Uppu ko Seigai, Uppu salt, ko the king, and Seigai manufacture. Earlier what was the prerogative of the king to manufacture, now it is being granted to an individual, or taxes were being taken which is now being directed to the new donee. Apart from this, we have a particular name, for instance Aparam Bali Vadam. In those days, people of a particular village, they had the responsibility of supplying good quality buffaloes to the touring royal officials. The royal officials, while on tour, they were to be supplied with good quality buffaloes, or instead the village people, they had to pay a kind of tax. It is said that Nallavum Nallarudu, that is good quality buffaloes to be supplied. Now, or you have to pay in cash or kind. This, in some instances, they are being exempted. So, it was a royal tax which sometimes was exempted from the religious donee. Then we have for instance Idai Putchi. Idai Putchi is a kind of tax which was imposed on the cattle breeders. Ilam Putchi, which was imposed on the toddy tappers. The king had the prerogative of getting taxes from these sectors. There is another very curious instance of Brahma Rakshak Kanam, that is, the Brahmin had to pay a tax for his protection, but C. Meenakshi says that possibly this was taken from the Brahmins as a kind of professional tax, that they got the money or the things that they got in kind for performance of religious duties. A portion is to be kept aside for payment to the king. So, it is Brahma Rakshak Kanam. Then there was another kind of tax, Kalyanak Kanam. Kalyanak Kanam is a tax which was sort of marriage tax. In later days, in the pre-modern period, in the late medieval period, the local rulers, Janmis, they had to be paid a kind of tax by the villagers when they went for a marriage ceremony to be conducted. Then we have Kuavan Kanam, which was imposed on the potters. Tattar Pattam, Tattar means hammering. Tattar Pattam was a kind of tax imposed on the goldsmiths, which we find in the later period, in the Chola period, very much prevalent. Then we have Visak Kanam. Visak Kanam, Viyavan and Kanam. Viyavan, the headman, and performing his duty, Viyavan, headman, was or he could claim for some kind of performance duty which was shifted to the state, or it was given to the headman. Then we have Taragu. Taragu is the brokerage to be paid. Then Nei Vilai. Neivilai is a kind of tax on the manufacturers of ghee, the clarified butter, who processed this thing. They had to give a tax to the state. And very important thing which has to be directly paid to the state, that is Echoru as well as Choru Mattu. Echoru, if we divide it, it comes as L, that is 24 hours of a day, and Choru, that is the boiled rice. Whenever the state officials came for a kind of tour on official duty, it was the responsibility of the villagers to come forward by offering them food, and it was meant as a tax. Same thing, Choru Mattu, Choru the boiled rice, and Mattu, that is the responsibility of giving the rice to the touring officials. So, all these things shows that there was many kinds of taxes, and generally it is a generic title, that Ashtadash Porihar, that is exemption from payment of 18 taxes. The number 18 is very significant, but if we glean through the inscriptions, we find that the names of different taxes, they are much more than 18. So, maybe it is a generic title used for any kind of tax exemption or exemption from payment of different types of taxes. It was there in the inscriptions. Similarly, in the Chalukyan inscriptions, we find it is Sarva Adana Bishuddha, exempted from any type of adan, that is any type of payment of taxes to the state. The doni, as I stated earlier, the land was not totally exempted, but the taxes which the earlier residents had to pay to the state exchequer, they are now generally being diverted to the new, I will not say ruler, but the new religious doni, for whom, for which the religious grant has been meant for. With these things, we find that between 600 to 900, in many of the things, in the making of the village administration, making of the varyams functioning, hesitant step has been taken towards perfection, which was later perfected exemplarily in the Chola period, but the process has already been started, and the functioning of the state in its different layers, that was also set afoot during this period from 600 to 900 AD.